Tim's here, otherwise known as the White Zulu or Fiki. And last week I told you about matric mischief when I left school and some of the odd, strange and very bizarre characters we had to deal with as school teachers. Anyway, this is about going to finishing school in Switzerland. And I'm calling it Stripping and Swearing. We arrived in Lisbon early on a grey, overcast morning, and as we stepped onto the tarmac, the ice-cold air hit me in the face like a bucket of freezing water. I couldn't get my coat on fast enough after vehemently having resented being forced to carry it in the Durban midsummer heat. We were proceeding through immigration to transfer to a flight to Rome, where Dad had arranged for us to spend a few days, when the most extraordinary sight met my eyes. It was a white woman pushing a broom across the floor. I was flabbergasted and stood and stared in disbelief. I'd never in my entire life seen a white person sweeping a floor. We arrived in a very chilly Rome on the 26th of December. Actually, it was the 27th because we left on Boxing Day, so it was the 27th, where Dad had booked us into a beautiful old hotel at the very top of the Spanish Steps. I gaped as I was shown my single room. It was palatial, built from ancient marble, and had what looked like original Renaissance frescoes on the walls and ceiling. There were towering marble pillars either side of the enormous windows, which looked out onto a massive open tiled Roman piazza or square, 1 story below. My huge bed was on a raised marble dais, and the bathroom was no less spectacularly sumptuous. There was a big marble sunken bath with gilt taps, and as I wandered around, admiring my magnificent surroundings. Dad had booked us on an evening tour with the concierge at the hotel's front desk, which included dinner and entertainment. And after we'd unpacked and changed, we were ushered onto a coach, which appeared to be packed with lively, chattering young Italians. Neither of us could speak a word of Italian, but the tour guide's English was excellent as he pointed out the various famous sights that Rome offered. The tour stopped at a dimly lit restaurant for dinner and the first part of our entertainment. We both ordered spaghetti, as it was the only dish we recognized on the menu. The waiter spoke no English, and our guide was seated elsewhere. After a while, the lights dimmed even more. A spotlight lit up a stage at one end of the room, and there was an announcement in Italian before a musical fanfare, and the curtain was drawn back to reveal a buxom young woman wearing nothing but a glittering bikini, stiletto heels, and a huge plume of ostrich feathers in a tiara on her head. She proceeded to gyrate to the loud music, while gradually and teasingly removing what little she'd been wearing, until all she had on was a small star over her revolving crotch and a pair of tiny tassels on her nipples, which she managed to whirl around in opposite directions in a most spectacular manner. I was quite impressed by this trick, but the rest of the act had very little impact. Any suggestion of titillation was completely lost on me, since I'd spent the best part of the last 6 years seeing naked young girls every day. I glanced at Dad, though, to see that his face had gone scarlet, apoplectic, and he was frozen in utter horror. By mistake, and his non-existent Italian, he'd managed to book us on a strip club tour. I caught his eye, and he blustered and began to try and apologize and explain the inexplicable. But I giggled and suggested we never, ever tell Mum about this escapade and should look at the funny side instead. This wasn't too hard, as on closer inspection, we noticed that our fellow coach tour mates were nearly all Italian sailors in white uniform who were whooping and howling with delight, encouraging the subsequent succession of girls to take everything off as they hurled handfuls of lira onto the stage like confetti. We were committed to this tour and went to several more, even bawdier nightclubs, shedding all the sailors en route until it was only us two, who were dropped off at our hotel in the early hours of the morning. I was woken by a knock the following day. I was woken by a knock on the door by room service, who delivered my first ever continental breakfast. As I ate, I heard a male voice singing the most beautiful Italian aria outside my first floor window. At first I thought it was the radio, but then, croissant in hand, I wandered over to see an ancient, bent-over, wizened gardener wearing a thick old coat and woolen fingerless metal mittens, raking up dead winter leaves in the courtyard, as he sang the stanza Nessun Dorme from Puccini's Turandot, one of his country's classical operas, a song which still melts my heart even today. The excellent acoustics in the semi-enclosed piazza amplified his tenor voice quite movingly. I was used to hearing our Zulu staff singing as they raked up leaves, but this was something really special. We did several more tours during the following days. The Sistine Chapel, the Vatican Museum, St. Peter's Cathedral, the Colosseum, and many others. Every day we walked down the Spanish Steps and wandered around the streets of Rome, but both of us were too terrified to cross any major roads, as the traffic was a mad frenzy of small, aggressively speeding cars like Fiats and Vespas, all hooting furiously, and the cursing drivers frequently lurched and swerved onto and off the pavements with reckless abandon. We also dined sedately every night in one of the many restaurants the hotel provided. Apparently, Dad didn't want to chance exposing his naive 17-year-old daughter to any more nocturnal depravity. Spain. 5 days later, we flew to Madrid and spent a few days sightseeing there. My hotel room, although top class, was rather disappointing after the one in Rome, but I was extremely comfortable and got to see the Royal Palace of Madrid, the official residence of the King of Spain, which was nearly as magnificent as the Vatican Museum, to me anyway, but on a much bigger scale. It was enormous and took us the whole morning to walk through the main public rooms with a guide. We then had a cocktail and lunch in a sumptuous restaurant at the top of the brand new Hilton Hotel overlooking all of ancient Madrid. We also took a coach tour out to Toledo to see the works of El Greco, otherwise known as Dominikos Theotokopoulos. Again, I found the Renaissance art almost overwhelming. By now, I was struggling with art overload after the Sistine Chapel and everything else I'd seen so far, and quite a lot was lost on me. We also went to see a bullfighting arena, happily for me, because the guidebook told us that clowns on horseback were used to distract the bulls during live performances, and that the horses often got injured in the ring, that there wasn't a bullfight that day. In the souvenir shop, Dad bought himself a gilt enameled paper knife in the shape of a bullfighter's sword, which he put in his back pocket and then sat on so heavily when he got back into the coach that it drew blood. I can still hear the swearing. We stopped to look at the Castillo de San Servando, a medieval castle near the banks of the Tagus River, and the Infantry Academy, and I was shocked when a white woman carrying a swaddled-up infant ran up to the windows of the coach, pleading and sobbing in Spanish. I was so upset that Dad had to placate me by telling me she was a gypsy and had a nice warm home to go to, plenty to eat, and it was all for show. But it was my first experience of begging, even though I'd spent all my life in rural Africa. If there'd ever been African beggars, I hadn't noticed. I hadn't noticed them, but I know now that begging was a criminal offence in South Africa in those times. And anyway, I'd barely spent any time in any towns or villages bigger than Nottingham Road, Moy River or Howick. We spent New Year's Eve in Madrid, a big celebration there, which involves everyone swallowing a whole grape for every stroke of the clock as it strikes midnight. That's 12 whole grapes to be swallowed, unchewed, in a very short time. And the locals at the New Year's party we were attending, put on by the hotel, thought it was hilarious that we extranjeros, foreigners, couldn't manage it. There was an American family sitting at the same large table as we were. They were parents taking their son, about 2 years older than I was, on a tour of Spain and the rest of Europe. Being the only English-speaking tourists at the table, we got chatting, and when the band struck up, the American boy asked me to dance. I was thrilled, as he was tall, dark, and very good-looking, in that well-built, sleek, and prosperous American way. I can't recall his name, but we danced all night, as Dad, most surprisingly and sportingly, I'll bet he wouldn't have done it if Mum was with us, left us quite early to go to bed, on the understanding that his parents would chaperone us and see me safely back to my room. This handsome young man was clever, warm, and had a delightful dry wit. I felt an electric chemistry between us, and fell a little bit in love with him that romantic night on the open balcony of the ballroom overlooking the lights of Madrid, with the live band playing Sinatra's Strangers in the Night behind us. I still have a photo of the two of us posing for the party's photographer on the dance floor. I wonder where he is now. Did he get called up to fight in Vietnam? Did he survive that brutal war? Is he a politician? Or does he work for NASA? So many questions. Switzerland. Dad and I flew to Geneva the next morning and boarded a train that took us to Montreux to catch the funiculaire, the cable railway up to Châteaudet, the mountain village where I was to spend the next 6 months. Geneva and the villages surrounding the lake had a light cover of snow, and I stared excitedly out of the train window as we travelled along the shores of Lake Geneva towards Montreux. Dad was as uncommunicative as always. He attracted the interest of an elderly Swiss-French lady sitting opposite us in the carriage. I began to try her in my halting matric French how thrilling it was to see so much snow. Although we had snow falling and even settling in deep drifts on our farm in the foothills of the Drakensberg every winter. But I found that, although I'd learned quite a bit of grammar and vocabulary, and had achieved what I assumed were higher marks in matric than the other subjects, not difficult. Languages come easily to me because I was already completely bilingual in Zulu and English. But due to the generally poor standards of teaching at my highly expensive and exclusive boarding school, I still couldn't speak more than a couple of words of the French language. To add to my problems, Zulu words kept replacing the French vocabulary I was searching for, and I realized that I actually couldn't speak the language at all. The woman kindly and patiently tried to help as much as possible with the simplest words as I gabbled and pointed and even tried to mime where I came from. I felt a bit disheartened, as I'd been convinced I could speak French quite well, or had been led to believe it from the lessons I'd done at school for the past 5 years. Eventually I shut up and quietly admired the scenery of Lake Geneva and all its exquisite beauty. She got off at Montreux, as did we, to change to the funiculaire, taking us up to Châteaudet. As the little train climbed into the mountains, the snow got thicker and deeper. The journey only took about an hour or so, and we climbed high into the Alps in this strange clockwork train, as the locals called it. La Fontenelle and the Anchaud family. At our destination in Châteaudet, we were met by Pax Buxton, a friend of Dad's, who tried his hand at farming years ago in the early 1950s. Pat had bought greystones originally built and farmed by one of my grandpa Ross's brothers. It was a farm with a lovely rambling old stone farmhouse, surrounded entirely by a wide veranda right near Fort Nottingham, to where Grandpa Ross had retired and lived there for all those years as we were growing up. Pat and his beautiful tall Tasmanian wife June, who had given me Toppy, my beloved little koala bear, when I was born, had 2 children, one of them who was a boy, Mickey, about Liz, my little sister's age. Their daughter, Lucinda, was much younger than any of us. Mum and Dad had spent a lot of time with the Buxtons, as they were of the right sort, and Mickey and I became very close in spite of the age difference, since he was game to try all the things I enjoyed, unlike Liz, my little sister, and he'd followed me around, faithfully joining in whatever it was that I was up to. He was company of sorts, and best of all, the Buxtons had a proper swimming pool. Admittedly, sometimes it was often bright green with algae and had frogs swimming in it, as well as water scorpions, but it was still better than our own river with its long, hot, and snake-infested trek there and back, wearing gumboots in the long grass, and much smaller pools with those nipping crabs. The Buxton's pool was right there in the garden, and we could dive and swim in it whenever we felt like it. They'd shared the government school run with us for a term, so we could learn enough Afrikaans to pass the entrance exam to St. Anne's, although Mickey went to King's School, a small private prep school for boys in Nottingham Road, which Dad had attended before he went to Michael House. Pat's experience of farming became the old adage, to make a small fortune in farming, start with a big one, and he wasn't cut out for it at all. Eventually, he sold up in about 1962, after Liz and I had gone to St. Anne's, and he retired to Chateau d'Ay in Switzerland, where he'd bought a very big chalet. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.